There's a fundamental mistake most people make when they look at occult symbols. They think they're looking at art, ancient scribbles, strange lines, something mystical, maybe even superstitious. But what if that's completely wrong? What if what you call a symbol is actually a machine? Not a physical machine made of metal and circuits, but a different kind of engineering. One designed not for the material world, but for something far harder to define: consciousness. The seals from the Ars Goetia, part of the old grimoire Lesser Key of Solomon, are usually presented as ritual art, diagrams used in ancient ceremonies to summon entities. But when you really look at them, something feels off. They're not symmetrical in the traditional sense. They don't follow decorative patterns. They're not beautiful in any human way. They're functional. Lines that shouldn't intersect, but do. Angles that feel aggressive. Structures that resemble circuits, but not of anything we recognize. And if you stare long enough, you start to notice something. They look less like drawings, and more like technical schematics, like architectural plans. As if someone was trying to build something, not in physical space, but inside human perception. Now, here's where everything shifts. These symbols weren't meant to be seen. They were meant to be processed. When you look at a sigil, your brain tries to decode it. It searches for patterns. It tries to organize what it's seeing. It tries to make sense of it, but it can't. And that's exactly where something happens. That failure creates a state of cognitive instability, a kind of mental noise, and inside that noise, something can align. Imagine for a second that human consciousness isn't a closed system, but a receiver. If that's even partially true, then shape matters, way more than we think. Some shapes amplify, others block, and some tune. Goetic sigils seem designed with that in mind, as if every line, every intersection, every angle was placed not for aesthetics, but for frequency. Not sound frequency. Not standard electromagnetic waves. Something subtler. Something operating right at the edge between perception and interpretation. There's one thing about these symbols that almost nobody talks about. They resist understanding. You can stare at them for minutes, hours, and still not fully memorize them. They slip through your mind. That's not an accident. It's actually a common trait of structures that aren't meant to be stored, but experienced momentarily. Like a key. You don't need to understand a key. You just need to use it. Now here's where things get uncomfortable, because this kind of geometry didn't stay in the past. It evolved. If you look closely at modern interfaces, apps, digital systems, platform design, you'll start noticing something strange. Minimalist but aggressive lines. Extreme contrast. Fragmented icon geometry. Symbols that look clean, but feel slightly off. That's not random. Modern design isn't just about aesthetics. It's about behavior. And behavior starts with perception. Every digital interface has a goal. Capture your attention, guide your focus, keep you engaged. But what if some of them are doing something more? What if, unconsciously, they're using ancient principles of sigilization, not to summon entities in the traditional sense, but to shape mental states, to create attention loops, to trap the mind in repetition, to convert focus into usable energy? If these symbols are really a form of engineering, not physical, but cognitive, then we're dealing with something way bigger than ancient occultism. We're dealing with perception architecture, attention engineering, manipulation of mental states through form. And that changes everything, because it means the battlefield isn't out there. It's right here, in how you see, in what you look at without noticing, in the patterns that enter your mind without permission. The real question isn't whether these symbols work. The question is, who designed them? Because one thing becomes clear when you look closely. This doesn't feel random. It feels intentional, as if someone, or something, understood the human mind long before modern science did, and encoded that knowledge into forms that survived centuries, forms that are still here, forms you've probably seen without realizing what they really were. But all of this leads to an even more disturbing question. Why do these shapes trigger immediate discomfort? Why do certain angles, certain intersections, just feel wrong to the brain? The answer might go way deeper than culture or learning. It might be rooted in the very structure of fear itself. And in the next part, we're going to break that down completely. There's a very specific moment when the human brain decides something isn't right. It's not rational, it's not conscious, and it's definitely not voluntary. It's instant. You look at a shape, and before you even understand what you're seeing, you already feel it. A subtle discomfort, a barely noticeable tension, a sense of threat you can't explain. So the real question is, why does that happen? Over millions of years, the human brain has been trained to survive, and survival depends on one thing: recognizing danger. Fast, very fast, before language, before logic. That means certain visual traits trigger automatic responses. Things like sharp angles, irregular lines, abrupt intersections, chaotic patterns. At a primitive level, your brain links these to teeth, claws, fractures, disorder. In other words, threat. Modern research in visual psychology shows something interesting. Sharp angles are perceived as more threatening than rounded shapes, even when they don't represent anything specific. A pointed triangle aimed at you can create more tension than a circle. Why? Because your brain associates sharpness with piercing, with intrusion, with damage. Now think about sigils. They're made almost entirely of points, intersections, harsh lines, unstable structures. That's not random. That's design. When you look at a complex sigil, something unusual happens. Your brain tries to predict the pattern, and fails. And every time your brain fails to predict something, it triggers alert mode. That creates tiny cognitive shocks, micro interruptions in your perception, and each one sends a signal. Pay attention, something's off. Now imagine that happening multiple times per second, while you keep staring. Here's where it gets deeper. Sigils aren't completely chaotic, they're almost chaotic. And that matters, because the brain can handle order, predictable patterns, total chaos, ignored as noise. But something in between, that's where it gets stuck. This state is sometimes called threshold complexity, when something is too complex to understand, but too structured to ignore. And that's exactly where attention gets trapped. Now, let's go even deeper. Some sigil patterns resemble structures found in nature when things are breaking down. Cracks in glass, dead veins in leaves, organic decay patterns, irregular noise similar to quantum phenomena. All of these share one thing. They signal instability. And the human brain is extremely sensitive to that, because in nature, instability shews risk. This part isn't talked about much, but it's important. Many occult symbols follow specific proportions, not random ones, and often they avoid classical harmony, like the golden ratio, and lean toward broken relationships, irregular divisions, intentional asymmetry, unbalanced distributions. This creates a constant feeling that something is off, and your brain hates that. Now connect all of this to a more abstract idea: resonance. In physics, a tuning fork vibrates when it matches a certain frequency. But what if the human mind has frequencies too? Mental states that can be triggered or amplified. If that's true, then visual forms can act as triggers, not because they have mystical power, but because they can induce specific states in the observer. States like low-level anxiety, hypervigilance, uneasy fascination, fixation. And here's the most dangerous part. When something creates discomfort plus curiosity at the same time, the brain can't let go. It gets stuck in a loop. Something feels wrong. The brain tries to understand. It fails. It tries again. Still fails. Attention stays locked. This loop can last seconds, or much longer. You don't have to believe in the occult for any of this to work, because this doesn't rely on belief. It relies on biology, on how your brain is wired, and that makes it way more interesting and way more concerning. If certain shapes can trigger fear, lock attention, create cognitive instability, then they might be doing more than we consciously notice. Maybe they're not summoning anything in the traditional sense, but they are creating conditions, adjusting the observer's internal state, almost like they're tuning the mind. But this leads to an even more unsettling question. What if these symbols aren't just psychological triggers, but structures designed to contain something? What if ancient methods treated these designs as prisons, or worse, as controlled gateways? In the next part, we're stepping into the most controversial territory yet: containment systems. And what happens when they fail? There's a recurring idea in ancient texts that most people today don't take seriously anymore. The idea that certain symbols weren't just representations. They were operational structures, tools, designed with a very specific purpose: to contain, to direct, and to control something invisible. In grimoires tied to the tradition of Solomon, especially the Lesser Key of Solomon, the instructions are incredibly precise, not just what symbols to use, but how to draw them, the exact size, the proportions between lines, the placement of names around the symbol, the distance between the operator and the seal. That doesn't sound like symbolic ritual. That sounds like precision engineering, as if even the smallest variation could break the entire process. One of the most important elements in these rituals is the circle, but it's not there for aesthetics. It acts like a boundary, a geometric barrier. Inside it, the operator stands. Outside it, the symbol is activated. And between those 2 points, there's tension, a controlled space, almost like the circle is an insulator, and the sigil is a conductor. Now look at the sigils again. They're full of intersections, points where lines cross in ways that seem random. But in ancient texts, those points are treated as crucial, as if each intersection acts like a node, anchor point, structural lock, which raises a strange possibility. What if the symbol isn't just a drawing, but a kind of grid? A framework designed to hold something in place within a defined structure. Now things get even stranger. Many of these rituals require one thing above all: focused attention. The operator has to stare, concentrate, visualize, repeat. Why? If it were just a symbol, none of that would be necessary. But if the symbol is a structure, then it needs something to activate it. And here's where a modern idea comes in. Attention is functional energy, not in some vague mystical sense, but neurologically. When you focus intensely on something, your brain activity spikes, your perception sharpens, your mind becomes highly receptive. Now imagine that energy being directed into a specific form, a form designed to capture exactly that state. Here's where things take a turn, because this process didn't stay in the past. It evolved. We don't draw sigils on parchment anymore. We build digital systems, interfaces, platforms, invisible architectures, and inside those systems, there are patterns. Some theorists suggest we're living through a new form of sigilization, not through ink, but through code. Structures, visual and logical, that capture attention, hold focus over time, create interaction loops, reinforce repetitive mental patterns. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly how social media, apps, recommendation systems are designed to work. Now, think about this. You look at the screen, but the screen also responds to you. It learns your behavior, tracks your patterns, adjusts itself in real time. That turns the interface into something dynamic, something that evolves, something that interacts with you. Put all of this together, and you get a pretty uncomfortable idea. Certain forms capture attention. Attention generates intense neural activity. Modern systems keep that attention locked in. That energy is constantly fed back into the system. So the real question becomes, where does all of that go? In ancient texts, the sigil was a point of contact, a medium, a channel. Today, those channels are far more complex. They're global, persistent, adaptive, and most importantly, massive in scale. Back then, a ritual involved one person. Now, millions of people interact with similar visual patterns every single day, for hours. The most unsettling question isn't whether this works, it's whether it was intentional. Because throughout history, secret societies have always shown interest in geometry, proportion, hidden symbolism, ritual architecture. And today, those same principles sit at the core of modern tech design. Hook for Part 4. But everything we've talked about so far still fits within something we understand. Lines, shapes, proportions. What if there are forms that go beyond that? Forms that don't follow the rules of space as we know it? Forms that actually break the way we perceive reality? In the next part, we're stepping into the most unstable territory yet. Mathematics that shouldn't work, but somehow does. There's an invisible line between what we can truly understand and what we can only perceive. Most of the math we learn describes a stable world. Straight lines, predictable angles, spaces that follow clear rules. But not all geometry was made to feel comfortable. Some of it was designed to do the opposite, to break the way you perceive space itself. Your brain depends on consistency. It needs to believe that. Parallel lines never meet. Objects have fixed dimensions. Space behaves logically. Now imagine looking at something that violates those rules. Not completely, but just enough to create doubt. This kind of structure is often linked to what's known as non-Euclidean geometry, a field of math where lines can curve through space, angles don't add up the way they should, distance itself becomes relative, and when your brain tries to process that, it fails. When the brain encounters forms that don't make spatial sense, it shifts into a very specific state. Mild confusion, perceptual distortion, a warped sense of depth. It's like looking at a staircase that goes up and down at the same time. You know it's wrong, but you can't mentally fix it, and that conflict creates something powerful. Deep, cognitive instability. Some theorists call this the geometry of madness. Not because it instantly drives someone insane, but because it creates conditions where perception can't be trusted. And when perception breaks down, something interesting happens. The mind becomes more suggestible, more open, more vulnerable, more receptive to external patterns. Now, zoom out. What if a sigil isn't just a small symbol, but a massive structure? A city, for example. Some theories suggest certain modern cities were designed with specific alignments. Avenues forming unusual angles, buildings placed in recurring geometric patterns, key points connected by invisible lines. From above, these layouts sometimes reveal something unexpected, structures that resemble circuits, or even sigils on a massive scale. These are sometimes called hypersigils. If we follow that idea for a moment, it leads somewhere unsettling. Cities wouldn't just be places to live, they'd also be low systems, movement networks, structures that channel human behavior, millions of people moving every day, following predictable paths, through geometry that was already defined. Now think of that like a circuit, a closed system. Here's another strange detail. Certain numbers keep showing up in symbolic architecture and occult systems, not randomly, deliberately. Things like specific ratios between height and width, repeating numerical patterns in structures, alignments tied to astronomical cycles. And these patterns don't fade over time. They persist, as if they were chosen to keep the system running, no matter the era. So here's a question. How does a symbol stay active for centuries? The answer might be math. If a pattern is built on fundamental relationships, it doesn't depend on culture. It doesn't depend on language. It doesn't depend on time. It works because it aligns with something deeper, something structural. Now take that idea to the extreme. What if reality itself is in some sense a grid? A structured system governed by rules we rarely question? And what if certain forms can press against that grid, not physically, but perceptually, creating local distortions in how we experience space and time? When you combine non-intuitive geometry, expectation-breaking patterns, large-scale structures, repeated exposure, you create an environment where the mind is constantly being challenged. And over time, that leads to something subtle, but cumulative. A kind of perceptual fatigue. If simple shapes can trigger fear, capture attention, create instability, then more complex structures can do far more. Maybe they're not doors in a physical sense, but they can act like interfaces, contact points, bridges between perception and whatever lies beyond it. But all of this leads to one final question. If these structures really affect the mind, what happens when we're exposed to them constantly? On screens, in cities, in logos, in digital interfaces, and more importantly, can you even escape it? In the final part, we move out of theory and into something much more urgent: how to recognize it and how to survive it. At some point, this stops being theoretical. It's no longer about ancient symbols. It's no longer about forgotten grimoires. It's no longer about secret societies. It's about you, about what you look at every single day. Because if even a fraction of what we've explored is true, even partially, then constant exposure to certain visual patterns isn't neutral. It has an effect, and the problem is, that effect is silent. The human brain wasn't built to handle constant, extreme stimulation, especially not patterns that break predictability, create ongoing micro-tension, hold attention without resolution. When you're exposed to that over and over again, things start to happen. Cognitive fatigue, shorter attention span, a constant feeling of restlessness, a need for stronger and stronger stimulation. But here's the most important part. You don't notice it happening, because it's gradual. Attention is a finite resource, and in the modern world, it's under constant attack. Apps, platforms, interfaces, all competing for it. But some visual patterns are better at capturing it than others, especially those that create visual tension, avoid clear resolution, keep the brain in a state of almost understanding. That state is incredibly effective, because your brain keeps trying to close the loop and never fully succeeds. Now look at something interesting. A lot of modern logos share very specific traits: minimalist but sharp, fragmented geometry, abstract symbols that don't clearly represent anything, high visual contrast. They look simple, but they're not neutral. They're designed to stick in your mind, create instant impact, be unforgettable. And in some cases, they may be using very old principles. Repackaged, modernized, disguised. It's not just logos, it's entire systems. Apps are designed to maximize time spent, reduce conscious effort, create unpredictable reward loops. And right in the middle of all that, visual design plays a huge role. Icons, layouts, animations, everything is calibrated. Everything is tested. Everything is optimized for one thing, keeping you looking. You open the app. You scroll. You see something interesting. Not fully satisfying, but just enough to keep going. Another scroll. Another hit. Another attempt to find something complete. And the cycle continues. This is the same pattern we saw before. Tension please curiosity. Retention. If you want to protect yourself, the first step is awareness. Start noticing shapes that make you slightly uncomfortable, symbols that feel empty but hard to ignore, interfaces that make you lose track of time, visual patterns you see over and over for no clear reason. These are signals, small ones, but consistent. The simplest way to break the cycle is to interrupt the pattern. Some practical ways to do that. Look away intentionally when something grabs your attention too hard, reduce time on platforms that feel compulsive, spend more time in organic environments, nature, soft shapes, curves, avoid long stretches of passive consumption. These may seem simple, but they're powerful because they give control back to you. Your brain is adaptable. That means it can recalibrate. When you expose it more to natural forms, harmonic patterns, less chaotic environments, it starts to stabilize again. Tension decreases, focus improves, your mind slows down. Maybe there isn't a single hidden master plan behind all of this. Maybe there isn't some central force controlling everything, or maybe there is. But regardless of that, the effects are real, because they operate at the level of perception, and perception shapes reality. In the end, it all comes down to one quiet decision you make every day, what you allow into your mind. Because once something gets in, it influences you, even if you don't notice, even if you don't believe it. You don't need to fear symbols, but you do need to understand one thing. Form is never neutral. It always communicates. It always influences. It always shapes. The difference now is that you've started to see it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it.